Hello everyone, I'm Aileen Wong. I'm studying weed management in agricultural settings. I see my research like playing a video game. How many of you have ever played video games? For those who have played, would you agree that in each level of the game, whatever you play, there is always a particular enemy or a task that is very difficult to tackle? It is similar in weed management. There are always a few weed species that are particularly difficult to control. In my research game, weeds are basically the plants farmers don't want, and they are my enemies. My goal is to develop long-term strategies to kill my enemies. My research game has different levels, and we are only allowed to use one weapon in each level until we are in the final level of the game. In this video, I want to show you how my enemies becomes difficult to control in each level of the game and what strategies I'm using to manage them. Let's start with the game at level 1. We are at a rice paddy field. Traditionally, rice farmers in Asia planted the paddies by hand. If farmers saw any weeds in the field, they will remove them by hand. Over hundreds of generations, we have found that a species called barnyard grass is able to survive under our hand weeding practice. It is because of the genetic variation in the appearance of barnyard grasses. Some barnyard grass populations look like rice seedlings in their early stage, and some don't. Look at the pictures on the right. The plants on the far right and the plants in the middle are both barnyard grass seedlings. The seedling in the middle and the rice seedling look very much alike, which is very difficult for us to distinguish between at the early stage. So farmers easily overlook them in the rice paddy fields. Over time, the barnyard grass populations that invade rice paddy fields would become more and more like rice in the early stage. This resemblance is a very famous example of crop mimicry. Moving on to the next level at level 2. Now we can use a mower to manage grasses in our lawn. When we mow our lawn at the same height every time, over a period of time, we can see that a species called green foxtail is taking over our lawn. We realize that some populations of green foxtail are able to grow shorter and shorter and even very close to the ground. Now, the green foxtail is challenging for us to manage with the mower. From level 3 to level 5, we have different weapons to kill weeds, like a tractor with a plow, livestock grazing, and burning. But we see the same thing happening. A few species were fine to survive despite our management practices. As we play along, there is very important lessons we learned. We cannot use a single practice repeatedly to control weeds because over time, weeds are able to adapt to the same management practice we used. Let's go to the next level. At this level, we are allowed to use what appears to be the most magical weapon, herbicides. Herbicides are the fairies in the game because they're powerful and just like a magic, most weeds will die after herbicides are applied. Look at the pictures on the left, which is after the herbicide application. And you can see that most weeds die. The herbicide fairies are a very effective tool, but we still should not rely on them. So if we look at the picture on the right and think about that, if we use the same herbicides repeatedly over a period of time, and we will end up having weeds that are resistant to the herbicides we used. And so those weeds will not die with the same herbicide. This is the same lesson we learned from the previous levels. We cannot rely on a single practice repeatedly to control weeds. Looking back on the history of weed management, since 1950s, when herbicides were invented, most farmers have been mainly using herbicides to control weeds. In the recent century, scientists have found many species populations that have developed resistance to two or more herbicides. And those populations are called multiple herbicide resistant weeds, which are the final bosses in my game. Apparently, the fairies are the key leading us to the final level of this game. In the northern Great Plains, the two most problematic multiple herbicide resistant species are wild oats and kochia. And these two are my target enemies. Right now, we have run out of herbicide options to manage the multiple herbicide resistant wild oats and kochia. Farmers will most likely increase the concentration of herbicides in order to kill them. And those chemicals from herbicides will eventually enter our food system and cause cancers to us. And it is happening now. We have found some chemicals in a lot of grain-based food products like breads and cereals that we consume daily. Now, all of us are a part of this game. If we cannot rely on herbicide fairies to kill the final bosses, what are the alternatives? Many researchers in the northern Great Plains have proposed alternative methods for managing multiple herbicide-resistant wild oats and kochia. Method 1 is crop diversification. These strategies provide defensive environments for crops to compete with wild oats and kochia. In my research, I have planted spring wheat, safflowers, lentils, and two forage crops, a combination of spring barley with pea and a combination of winter chitikil with pea. And forage crops are the crops that used to feed livestock. Method 2 is sheep grazing. The sheep will eat all the forage crops and weeds in the field. I used sheep here because they are easy to move around in my experimental fields. Method 3 is plowing. Plowing and sheep grazing are the direct attacks to the enemies. Right now, I'm assessing these methods to understand how the final bosses respond to each method. Then I will rate each method according to its effectiveness in controlling the final bosses. During the growing season, my helpers and I were in the fields counting the number of my enemies. We don't count all the enemies in the entire field. We only select some locations. For example, in a spring wheat field, we randomly select 10 locations and mark them with the frames. And then we will went back to the same frames to collect data. In the early season, we counted the number of enemies that emerged. Then later, we went back to the same frame to count the number of seedlings. At the end of the growing season, we count the number of mature plants and the number of seeds each mature plant produced. And after I have collected all this data, I can use them to build a model in a computer. And this model is called population dynamic model. It is used to predict the enemy's populations in the field over a period of time. In this example, I set the time as 50 years. The y-axis is the number of wheat seeds in the soil, and the x-axis is the time. And the line going up means the population is increasing, and going down means the population is decreasing over the 50 years. At year 50, you can see that the population becomes zero, which means the multiple herbicide resistant wild oats and kochia, my target enemies, died, and my mission is completed. However, there is a hidden information from this graph. Each year represents a single management practice. Using the hidden information, I will be able to find out all the effective combinations of methods over the 50 years. And these will be the long-term strategies, and I will propose them to farmers. This coming summer, I will build a model and I hope to provide strategies for farmers to fight the long-term battle against weeds and win the real game. With that, I want to thank my advisors, Dr. Fabian Manella and Dr. Tim Saipo, for the opportunity to learn and work with them on this project. I want to thank my funding sources, Montana's Wheat and Barley Committee and USDA NIVE for supporting the research, and the STEM storytellers for the opportunity sharing my research with you. Thank you everyone for listening, and see you next time.